Welcome to the Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Schechtman. If there is any one problem that runs through the center of American foreign policy over the past 70 years, through 8 successive administrations, Republican and Democrat alike, it is the always complicated, sometimes poisonous relationship with Iran. The markers along the road are tall. The U.S. coup that installed the Shah, the 1979 hostage crisis, Khobar Towers, Lebanon, Holocaust denial, and the continually failed U.S. efforts to seize opportunities when presented by Iran have all contributed. It seems that our relationship with Iran never misses an opportunity to miss an opportunity. 40 years ago, the Iran hostage crisis forever transformed our view of that nation. For many, our memories of and attitude towards Iran were frozen in place at that precise moment in time. As students yelled death to the Shah, it set in motion a chain of events that has become part of the DNA of both countries. Trying to understand it and treat it has been one of the central pillars of American foreign policy. Yet with each successive treatment, the disease always threatens to burst out and become full-blown. That's where we are once again. As Winston Churchill once described the former Soviet Union, Iran is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma. Few understand this dynamic better than my guest, Gary Sick. Gary served on the National Security Council staff under Presidents Ford, Carter, and Reagan. He was the principal White House aide for Iran during the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis, and is the author of several books on U.S.-Iranian relations. He's a retired captain in the U.S. Navy with service in the Persian Gulf, North Africa, and the Mediterranean. He was the Deputy Director for International Affairs at the Ford Foundation. He has a Ph.D. in political science from Columbia, where he's a senior research scholar, adjunct professor of international affairs, and the former director of the Middle East Institute. And he is the founder and executive director of the Gulf 2000 Project. It is my pleasure to welcome Gary Sick to the Who, What, Why podcast. Gary, thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's a real pleasure to be with you.
Why do we have such a continuously difficult time understanding Iran?
Well, there's 2 problems. One is that we don't understand Iran, despite our long relationship and the vast amounts of printer's ink that has been spilled talking about our relationship with Iran. We still know very little about that society. But beyond that, even if we know something about Iran, it has become our go-to enemy in the Middle East. That when we are looking for a core around which we can create a foreign policy, Iran has become that. And because of the hostage crisis and the really difficult relationship that we've had, Iran has almost no friends in the United States. And so it is easy to hate, and it is easy to use as a sort of all-purpose demon to justify whatever it is we're trying to do in the Middle East at any given moment. And Iran does its part in contributing to that point of view. Iran has, on one hand, made some very generous offers and has attempted to, in fact, get out of this bind that the 2 countries are in. But they have also behaved very badly, for instance, taking hostages, and not just at the original one, but basically arresting people for no particularly good reason and holding them for very long periods of time. And this is kept alive, this view of Iran. It's really ironic that, that about the same time as the Iranian Revolution, we were fighting in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, we lost over 50,000 American lives and, destroyed a country. It was horrendous, and we all know that history. But today we have good relations with Vietnam. People go there for visits. People go there for vacations. Whereas with Iran, the political difficulties were huge, but there really was very little loss of life involved, especially for Americans, maybe 2 or 3 at the time of the revolution. And we today, 40 years later, are in a situation where we have less contact, less involvement, and probably less interchange between Americans and Iranians than we've had in the last 70 years. So it has become a sort of permanent feature of American foreign policy, and it's hard to see how we're going to get out of that.
And yet there are two generations of policymakers, essentially, that have come and gone since the hostage crisis 40 years ago, and it seems there's never really been an opportunity for a full reset in terms of those relations.
That's very true, and for the people who are angry with Iran today, in many cases, were not even alive at the time of the Iranian Revolution. President Obama really made a full-scale effort to try to change that involvement, to try to change the narrative of our relationship with Iran. He initiated negotiations with Iran, negotiated with them for 3 straight years, and produced an agreement, which is called the JCPOA, or the Iran nuclear deal, which basically dramatically reduced Iran's capacity to move toward a nuclear weapon, which was regarded as the most serious problem between the two countries at the time. And I would argue actually went a very long way to preventing Iran from ever getting a nuclear weapon, despite the propaganda that's come out about the agreement. Since that time, the reality was that Iran accepted in perpetuity that they would be inspected by the IAEA inspectors. People would be keeping an eye on what they did, and they made a flat promise without any qualifications whatsoever that they would never, under any circumstances, build or store or use nuclear weapons. That was a huge step forward. But it didn't fit into the reigning view of Iran as the enemy, and basically was thrown out then by President Trump. And that, more than anything else, if we're looking for reasons why we're having a crisis right now, it is a crisis of our own making. I mean, basically, at the end of the Obama administration, there were direct contacts with Iran that had been opened up for the first time really since the revolution. There was an agreement that was being enforced and which actually was being observed by Iran in great detail, which hugely restricted its access to nuclear materials. There was the possibility of then building on that to go to the next level and begin examining some of the issues that were not addressed in the nuclear agreement. And those possibilities of direct contact, negotiation, and building on an existing successful agreement were lost when we turned the other way, walked away from the agreement without cause. We didn't cite anything except that it was that one administration didn't like what a previous administration had done, and then imposed the most severe sanctions in history on a country that we were not at war with. So in effect, what we've done is gone from a position of having a working relationship with Iran, where we could actually talk to each other about issues. We've gone from that position to, in fact, we have, for all practical purposes, declared war, economic war on Iran. And it's very clear that there are people in the White House and in the State Department whose principal objective is to try to bring down the government of Iran, to destroy it, and without any great thought about what might come along to replace it. So we've gone from one extreme to the other, and I think it was a tragedy, actually, because none of this was necessary. By the end of the Obama administration, Iran was not thinking about taking hostages. There was the people at the highest level had access to each other for a kind of hotline arrangement. If something was going wrong, they could be in touch with each other. There was talk about negotiating on other issues that were of particular concern to the United States. And Iran was, in fact, not making nuclear material that would have been dangerous. All of that has changed, and it was basically because we chose not to continue with that arrangement, and basically under the fiction that we were going to somehow improve it. I think we have shown very clearly that that strategy was not realistic, in the sense that we would somehow improve the situation that we had with Iran. We've made it much worse, and it's very difficult to see how this present crisis is going to resolve itself.
Do we have any clear understanding, and is it in fact relevant, as to what the incentive was for Iran to enter into the negotiations they did with the Obama administration that resulted in the JCPOA?
The people who negotiated with Iran got to know the people on the other side very well. They spent a lot of time together, and I think they understood very well what the Iranians were thinking. And in effect, what the Iranian negotiators were looking for was a reduction of the sanctions that had been placed on them that would give them an opportunity to re-engage with the international community. And that was, that's not, Iran has its own national interests, but that was one of them. And it was very clear that the Rouhani administration, that was what they were after. They were looking for an opportunity to open up their system beyond where it had been since the revolution. There were lots of people in Iran who opposed that. And so you can focus, if you're looking at what's going on in Iran, you can focus either on the people who are making an effort to try to get out of the bind that they've put themselves in with the revolution and the Islamic Republic afterwards, or there are the people on the other side, the Revolutionary Guard and others, who say we should never open up to the outside world because they will simply come in and poison us and take away from us the revolutionary achievements that we have made. And so there is a fight going on within Iran. And what the JCPOA really did was give a little advantage to the people who really wanted to open up the system and basically have Iran become, in effect, a more normal country and less the sort of revolutionary cause. That was one of the objectives, and I think it was well understood by the people who negotiated the JCPOA. As we see, they did get the Rouhani and company became sort of rock stars for a while. They were so popular in Iran because it was understood that they were making life easier for people in Iran. But then the United States, by walking away from the JCPOA, completely undercut the people in Iran who were interested in some kind of reform and change, and have actually strengthened greatly the hardliner group, who are now in ascendance, and they're coming up on new parliamentary elections just next month, and everybody is pretty much agreed that the hardliners are going to win the parliament. They're going to kick out the people who were in favor of the Rouhani government, and we're going to end up with a very much more militant and old-style revolutionary government in Iran than we've had before. And that, to me, is, it was a huge missed opportunity.
To what extent does the U.S. relationship with Saudi Arabia play a role in the decisions that we've made with respect to Iran?
Well, I think the Saudis really believed that when the Trump administration came in, that they basically had a very good friend in Washington, and that basically they could then pursue their own foreign policy interests, knowing that the United States would back them up. That has proved not to be the case. And without going through the entire litany of things that have happened, the reality is that as the United States put tremendous pressure on Iran, not surprisingly, Iran struck back. That no country, well, basically we removed like 40% of Iran's national income. The United States did unilaterally, simply eliminated that a huge portion of Iran's ability to pay its own bills and run its own government. That was a huge blow, and no country is likely to sit still and just take that if that's what is done to them. So Iran struck back, and it did it in a number of ways, interfering with tanker traffic in the Gulf, the shoot down of a drone, and then the attack on Saudi oil fields, which took basically 50% of Saudi Arabia's oil off the market for a limited period of time. That was an enormous blow and was absolutely contrary to what the United States had always said, that they were there to protect the free flow of oil in the Gulf, and the United States basically didn't respond. And what the people in the United Arab Emirates and in Saudi Arabia really came to understand was that they were extremely vulnerable. The United States could act with a degree of impunity because we were so big and so strong that the Iranians couldn't really strike us in any seriously effective way, not as a serious threat to our own national existence. But the Emirates and Saudi Arabia were in a very different position. They were within just minutes of the missiles that could be launched from Iran, and they were highly vulnerable. They had they get their water from desalinization plants along the Persian Gulf, which are basically undefended. And so a series of missile strikes, for instance, on that would deprive them of, their water, not to mention the fact that their oil facilities are, as they discovered, vulnerable to attack by highly accurate missiles. And the Iranians surprised everybody by the tremendous accuracy of their attack. So the Saudis and the UAE have responded to this not by aligning themselves even closer with the United States, but rather have been engaging in negotiations independently with Iran, with the idea of reducing the threat, that they would end up being the people who would pay for whatever the United States did. They would be the fall guy. They would be the ones who paid the price for that. And they've really looked down that barrel and decided they don't like it. And both sides have actually initiated negotiations with Iran to try to mitigate that problem. So, in effect, the relationship between the United States and Saudi Arabia has turned out to be a surprise to Saudi Arabia. And I think we're seeing the Saudis and the other Arab states in the Gulf basically hedging their bets with regard to the United States, because they've decided that is not, that basically they have no control over what the United States may do, and they're the people who will end up paying a price for it.
Where does terrorism and the battle against ISIS fit into this equation today?
Well, Iran, after ISIS broke out of its territory in Syria and started driving toward Iraq, Iran was the leading force to put together an opposition that basically stopped ISIS in its tracks before it got to the holy sites in Iraq, and also they were aiming at Baghdad, and they stopped them short of Baghdad. Ironically, it was General Qasem Soleimani who mobilized that force and intervened to stop ISIS from its attack. They then have been fighting ISIS independently at the same time that we've been fighting ISIS. So in effect, the United States and Iran, and President Trump actually said that explicitly, that this was something that worked to the interest of both parties, and he said that explicitly in his speech after Soleimani was killed. So basically, the United States and Iran shared an interest in fighting and destroying ISIS, and Iran's role in doing that has been almost entirely ignored by in the United States, simply because if Iran is the enemy, we don't want them to be seen as doing something that was useful for our purposes. So it has gotten almost no attention whatsoever. And the fact that Iran was fighting ISIS at the same time we were fighting ISIS was simply overlooked. But in any case, they have been and were, and basically have shared a great deal of responsibility in the fact that of taking ISIS out of operation. And so in that sense, it's something that we actually do share.
Given this broader framework, how do we explain the reaction thus far, at least, to the killing of Soleimani, and why has the reaction been seemingly so restrained?
Well, the killing of Soleimani was a huge shock to Iran, and he had become a real hero, and he had become a hero in Iran primarily because he had led the charge against ISIS, and people took the position that if Iran didn't face up to ISIS and stop them in Syria and Iraq, that they would end up having to fight them in Iran. And so the fact that he mobilized that opposition had made him a national hero. And the reaction in Iran to his death was clearly national and clearly emotional and dramatic, actually. There were millions of people who went out in the streets and marched. But then at the same time, Iran responded to this. They felt that they had to do something. So they launched a dozen missiles or so at a base in Iraq that had Americans stationed there. And although nobody was killed, the attack was severe, and in the sense of having these missiles raining down over a period of an hour or so was enormous. And we do know that there were some people who, even though they were not hit by the missiles themselves, they suffered concussions and have had to go for medical treatment abroad. So there was an Iranian reaction, but again, it's pretty clear that throughout the reactions that the Iranians have shown, they've made a considerable effort to avoid hitting Americans and causing causing Americans to lose lives. That it was clear that was a red line, and they've only really missed one time, and that is there was an American contractor on one of the bases where they were coming under attack, who happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, and that triggered the White House reaction to Soleimani. But the idea that somehow by getting rid of Soleimani you were going to resolve the problems that Iran was causing in the rest of the Middle East was simply false. One of the things that Soleimani had done was really build an organization that was resilient and that was institutionalized. It was not something that was based on one man. And so he was not the Quds Force. He was the front man. He was certainly the person that represented that, and his picture was sort of the picture of the Quds Force. But the Quds Force has not collapsed. Immediately they appointed his deputy, who Soleimani had actually groomed on the grounds that he thought that he was going to die. He didn't take very many precautions personally. He was out on the battlefield. He had his picture taken with the troops. He traveled on a commercial aircraft. He didn't do very much to protect himself, and he knew that he was taking risks, and so he had actually prepared someone else to take his place, who is perhaps less charismatic, but the organization goes on. So, this is a victory for the United States, but it's also a very serious setback, because basically now the Quds Force and Iran in general is really interested in revenge, and that is something that could go on for a very long time. So fundamentally, what this has done is place a target on the back of a lot of Americans who are working in the Middle East, and that this may go on for years. I mean, that it's not something that they'll either strike in the next 15 minutes or never. More likely, this is something that, we can see people, perhaps Americans, getting assassinated in the Middle East for a period of years in response to this, because there are people who are aggrieved and who feel that the United States has basically opened Pandora's box. If the United States can assassinate a senior leader in another government, then why shouldn't we be subject to the same treatment? And I don't think that was fully appreciated in Washington at the time that the decision was made, but that is one of the outcomes, and we don't really know what that's going to look like, because this could extend over a very long period of time.
Talk a little bit about the disconnect between American actions and the potential response, as you're detailing now, and the broader international community's reaction to this, particularly the European nations that were all part of the JCPOA, and what it means for their ongoing relationship with Iran.
Well, the Europeans were totally opposed to the U.S. decision to withdraw from the JCPOA. They felt that the agreement was working. They were quite prepared to work with the United States to come up with a solution to some of the other problems with Iran, and they were prepared to pursue that very actively. But they thought that throwing the JCPOA out was literally throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and that there was no need to do that, that you could pursue the other interests while maintaining the huge benefits that the United States and the other countries had. What's happened in the meantime is that the Europeans have discovered that with an administration in Washington that is prepared to take huge risks and to basically act contrary to the interests of its allies, that they really are unable to intervene, that words are not enough, and that they are not in a position to challenge the United States on the financial side. So they have proved to be very, very weak in terms of trying to respond to the problem. And that has become very evident. And so over time, Iran, which originally thought that the Europeans would assist and come to their rescue, at least to some degree, have been terribly disappointed. And at this point, the Europeans and the Iranians are really on a downward path in terms of their relationship that is going nowhere good. And so both the Europeans, who felt that they could play an independent role, and the Iranians, who had counted on the Europeans to provide some support during this period. Everybody has been disappointed, and the European role has turned out to be very, very slight, and they can still play some role, but basically the United States has shown no interest in working with the Europeans for any kind of an intermediate solution. And the Europeans have become very aware of that, and also aware that they don't have the financial capability to really challenge the United States if the United States is prepared to ignore their interests completely, which has simply been the case.
And finally, in your view, is there any good, anything positive that can come out of recent U.S. actions, the murder of Soleimani, or anything else that's transpiring now?
It is really difficult to come up with a silver lining in any of this. Basically, almost everybody has been weakened. The U.S., as I said, U.S. relationships with their countries in the Middle East, the Gulf Arabs, for instance, have been weakened. Our relationship with the Europeans and other allies have been weakened. Our own position in Iraq, for instance, where we are fighting ISIS, the Iraqis have been absolutely furious at the United States for, in effect, carrying out an assassination on their soil by someone who was carrying a diplomatic passport and was actually on his way to a meeting with the Prime Minister of Iraq. They say that this is an abuse of America's role in Iraq and contrary to the terms of an agreement, and they are anxious to try to get the Americans to leave. They may or may not succeed in that, but this is another crisis that has been created where the United States now, its role in Iraq has been severely affected because of our own behavior. It's really very difficult to find a silver lining, and the one thing which, from my own perspective, watching U.S. policy in the region, not just the Trump administration, but over years, our role in the Middle East has not produced a very positive result. And watching it year after year, it's very clear how negative those results have been. One of the things that may come out of this is that the United States, which was moving slowly to reduce its footprint in the Middle East, that process may in fact be accelerated. And if so, from my perspective, that would not be a terrible thing. And that basically President Trump really wants to get out of the Middle East, and a lot of people share that view and would see that as a good thing. So to the extent that our behavior has in fact accelerated our likelihood of reducing our presence in the Middle East, our military presence, that may be a good thing, but that may be a bit of a stretch.
Gary Sick, I thank you so much for spending time with us here on the Who, What, Why podcast.
It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And thank you for listening and for joining us here on Radio Who, What, Why. I hope you join us next week for another Radio Who, What, Why podcast. I'm Jeff Sheckman. If you like this podcast, please feel free to share and help others find it by rating and reviewing it on iTunes. You can also support this podcast and all the work we do by going to whowhatwhy.org/donate.